coast to coast, direct from Austin. You're listening to the Alex Jones Broadcasting Network.
From his Central Texas Command Center, deep behind enemy lines, the information war continues. It's Alex Jones and the GCN Radio Network.
It's Paul Joseph Watson on the Alex Jones Show with David Knight, this Sunday edition. We got a lot of interesting guests coming up later this week. I'm going to be back in studio on Wednesday through Friday. A lot of really good guests lined up, so be sure to mark that in your diary. We got some calls coming up after the next break. Byron in Pennsylvania is going to be first up. But for the moment, we're talking about this Foreign Affairs article, which is, of course, the CFR's publication. Basically, the CFR runs the State Department in the United States, as Hillary Clinton admitted. And they're talking about the populist uprising, both in America and throughout Europe. And this is interesting. I mean, I highlighted several passages of the article earlier today. Here's a quote: "And yet when most Westerners hear the word democracy today, what they picture is a political atmosphere that is respectful, predictable, and a little staid, a system in which a small number of long-standing political parties alternate in government on a semi-regular basis, resulting in reasonably moderate changes to public policy." So basically, that is the CFR admitting their agenda to keep the two-party monopoly in place, both in the United States with the Republicans and the Democrats, and in the UK with the Tories and the Labour Party. The threat to that system in the UK is the UK Independence Party, and of course the Tea Party sentiment rising in some factions of the Republican Party in the United States. And basically in this article, they admit that, I mean, here's another quote. This you really need to get a hold of this if you can get your hands on the magazine. Quote: "To harness the passion of the populace to the cause of reinvigorating governance, but without helping them kindle the flames of an anti-democratic revolt." So they're admitting they need to harness the power of the populist uprising to reinforce the power of the state, which of course runs completely opposite to the goal of this populist uprising, which is to work towards smaller government, towards anti-statist objectives. So the fact that they're talking about, you know, co-opting this movement to increase the power of the state, and later they talk about wealth redistribution, is absolutely amazing that it's so brazen in the CFR's own publication. David Knight, your comments on this?
We've already seen that, Paul. We've seen it with both the Tea Party as well as with the Occupy movement, that both of the mainstream political parties have moved in to co-opt those movements, to take them over. They're born out of frustration, fundamentally, both of them, with the banking system and the abuses of the central banks and the very large, powerful banks that are too big to jail, as Eric Holder put it. That was the initial movement of the Tea Party, where they came out, by some people's account, 500,000 people went to Washington to protest the banker bailouts. And of course, the left's Occupy movement is also upset about what the bankers are doing. So what they do is both parties try to co-opt that. Both parties try to shut that down. The Republicans don't want to see Tea Party candidates elected. They've got their own mainstream candidates who, very much like the situation in Hong Kong, are vetted by the elitists. China wants to vet any candidate that appears on the ballot in Hong Kong. That's why you've got thousands of students protesting, and that's now turned into a violent protest, whether that was started by agent provocateurs or whether it was started by the police or whether it was just some hotheads, who knows, because we've seen that happen as well. We've seen agent provocateurs in COINTEL programs. That is essentially what's happening, but very often we don't hear that admitted in America. That's what's unusual about this, is that the CFR, which essentially has controlled the State Department in America since its creation, even though Reagan wasn't a member of the CFR, the first president since its foundation to not be a member, he subsequently appointed 300 people from the CFR into the State Department.
It's amazing. We're going to get more into this after the break. We're going to take your calls. John Rappaport is coming up to talk about Ebola and the CDC whistleblower. This is the Alex Jones Show live, Infowars.com. Stay tuned.
cells become toxic, they die early, and aging sets in.
DNA Force.
No one has put together a formula that focuses directly on brain health, nerve growth factors, and optimizing your cellular energy at the same time. Just one of the key compounds, BioPQQ, is backed by major clinical studies.
DNA Force.
We now have the synergistic solution. Secure your DNA Force today at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll-free 888-253-3139.
DNA Force.
The government's Department of Homeland Security is buying up loads of ammo. At the same time, they're restricting civilians' rights to own and purchase firearms. Can you put two and two together? Infidel Body Armor can stop every round, including hollow points and .308 sniper rounds, is reasonably priced and fully legal. But for how long? Go to InfidelBodyArmor.com, spelled INFIDEL bodyarmor.com. Infidel Body Armor. Just won't quit.
To the earth, riches, and wisdom. So we have even right there.
What's his name?
This is an emergency transmission from FEMA Region 6 in occupied North America.
There is a war. It's happening now. It will decide the fate of humanity. The time to choose sides has come. We are the resistance. We are the InfoWar.
It's the Alex Jones Show on this Sunday, live edition, September 28, 2014. Riding shotgun is David Knight. We're going to go to your calls now. First up is Byron in Pennsylvania, who wants to talk about a shelter-in-place warning in Pennsylvania. Byron, go ahead.
Yes, it's Brian, but anyway, yeah, I'm surprised it wasn't picked up or covered here, because it's, pretty big. They've been searching people's houses and everything for this guy that shot up police barracks.
Is that a breaking story? Did that happen just recently?
That actually happened over a week ago, and it's still happening.
Right, so they've got areas of Pennsylvania locked down then because of this incident.
Yeah.
So
That's
what's happening there?
Mention it.
So tell us what's happening.
What's happening is they've had stories on the news about, not like I saw one article and put it all together, but they had stories on the news about food being donated for people who were sheltering away from their homes and stuff like that, and for the police, and it's all crazy.
That's interesting. We'll have to look into that. It's not something that I picked up on, but definitely we'll take a look into that. Thanks for the call. Janitor in FEMA Region 9, go ahead.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. What's your point today?
Fantastic. I just want to talk about the 10 companies that own us and how Mr. Jones was talking about boycotting. There's an article on HuffPost. It's a pretty old one. It's called "These 10 Companies Control Enormous Numbers of Consumer Brands," and it just keeps continuously getting bigger. And in order to control these globalists, it's very systematic, very simple to do. You look at the brands, and you systematically stop buying the brands in, just-in-time type of a way. You cut the money supply off, and there's no need to, I'm not saying that propagandizing it or whatnot, but that's how you basically cut the arms of these very slowly with their own capital. And if you look at that list, and that list it's very old. It's about from 2012. It keeps getting bigger and every day, and how the monopolies control it in every single brand. For example,
so what are the top two companies on the list?
It's Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Johnson & Johnson. Procter & Gamble owns Lacoste perfumes. I mean, you just have to. You can't buy Coca-Cola at Pizza Hut because Pepsi owns it. So it's very systematic, and
do you think
if you go about
so, David, do you think that the power of boycotting companies still has influence in the modern era?
Well, I guess my first reaction would be that if this is a couple of years old, it's probably not 10 companies now. It's maybe 8 or 7 because they keep consolidating. But yeah, I think it's very important not just to boycott, But I think it's positive to do it's good to do something positive, and that is to support local businesses. You know, when all you do is trade with the chains and all of your neighbors' small businesses go out of business, and I used to have a small business. So it's important for people to support those who are starting, who take the risk to be an entrepreneur in their local area. Support those people, because they're going to be spending money in your area too. So, you know, try to build that local economy. It's one of the things I like here about Austin, is that it's one of the few places that I've lived where there's actually viable mid-level restaurant businesses. There was an article that was up on Drudge recently about how this one famous chef was saying that Obama was, with his increased regulation and with competition from major chains, they were squeezing out all the mid-level restaurants. So you had nothing but really high-end restaurants that were locally owned and national chains, and that was about it. So yeah, support your local businesses, because that's going to help you in the long run. It may look like it's cheaper to go out and buy something from a big box store, but ultimately it's going to reverberate back in your own community.
Julio in Wyoming, you're on the air. Go ahead. Do we have Julio?
I think he's on.
Am I there, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I almost did a double take because you're here in the North American Union, so welcome across the pond, and don't stay in Austin too long. Go explore the United Nations national parks here in the United States, like Yellowstone here in Wyoming. It's beautiful. You could meet Dick Cheney, Paul.
That's not a very tempting prospect, to be honest.
It's beautiful out here, Paul. Anywho, the doublespeak, ISIS, ISIL, we're going to war against war. War is peace. 2 + 2 is 5. It's quite clear corporate media here in the United States and corporate media in Europe are doing their best to try to sell the propaganda that the multinational corporations want us to hear. And it's quite clear, especially more so in Europe, I see. I mean, you live in Europe, so I want to get your take, Paul, on how people aren't buying the bull from corporate media. I want to get your thoughts on that. And then secondly, Paul, I'm a journalist here in Wyoming. How can I interview you on what's going on in Europe?
The best way is to contact me on Facebook. But in terms of ISIS propaganda, I mean, the biggest propagandists for ISIS are the mainstream media. I mean, every time I turn on the mainstream media, you know, CBS, CNN, they're showing ISIS propaganda videos. So, you know, on the one hand, we've got David Cameron saying that we shouldn't watch ISIS propaganda. We got the Metropolitan Police in Britain saying that it may be a terrorist offence to even view these beheading videos. And yet every time I turn on CNN, there's an ISIS propaganda video. So again, you know, we've had past investigations into who's behind the release of terrorist propaganda videos. It leads back to the Pentagon, Department of Defense, with Intel Center, with these other corporations that get the videos first. So the biggest progenitors of ISIS propaganda is the mainstream media itself, while we're being demonized, characterized as terrorists for even watching videos on YouTube. So, David Knight, your take on that?
Well, that may be changing, Paul, because they've taken away the prohibitions from directly addressing the American people with propaganda. Remember, since the Cold War, they had prohibitions against using Radio Free Europe and Voice of America here domestically. But just as we've seen the prohibitions on domestic surveillance of citizens fall by the wayside and be ignored, they have actually changed that law now that's going to allow them to directly propagandize us. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But certainly you're right. It's a mockingbird media. And I think it was just appalling when we saw at the end of the week last week the articles that have come to light about what happened with Gary Webb, that they dedicated at the Los Angeles Times 17 reporters to essentially destroy him because the CIA wanted his credibility taken away, because he had exposed the truth about their dirty little wars at the time. It wasn't in the Middle East, but they were really more focused down in Central America, and they were using the cocaine traffic there to fund their operations and running that cocaine into America, into California, essentially creating the crack cocaine craze. And he exposed that, and so they used the mainstream media to take him down, and that's starting to come to light now.
And I mean, what